You guys better hold on for this one, because this video may very well get taken down by YouTube, because we're going to go down the rabbit hole of abortion. We're going to expose the population control agenda. We're going to expose Margaret Sanger, and we're going to talk about how this is deeply rooted in racism and murder. So without further ado, we're going to talk about Margaret Sanger, who founded Planned Parenthood in 1916. And we're going to talk all about the brief history of abortion, eugenics, population control, murder, and the 1939 Negro Project. So buckle up, boys and girls. We're going to first talk about how the left is going to try to talk about how this is women's empowerment, and well, it's a complex issue, and we need to understand the different interpretations. They're going to try to spin this as a positive thing, because that's what the leftists do, which is deeply rooted in racism. But we're going to talk about Margaret Sanger. This is what it tells you from Google AI, and watch the left-wing spin as I read this. It says Margaret Sanger, a pioneer in birth control, which is murder, the founder of Planned Parenthood, held views on eugenics, a discredited ideology. Eugenics, popular among certain circles in the 20th century, that was the Nazis and the Nazis and the pro-abortionists were the two groups that supported eugenics. For those of you that don't know, aimed to improve the human race through selective breeding, often targeting marginalized groups like the poor, people with disabilities, immigrants, and people of color. Now, I want you to understand that whenever they say marginalized groups, minority groups, disempowered groups, that's communism. This is a form of communism. Communism oppresses by class. The Nazis did it by race. The fascists did it by national identity. Whenever they say marginalized groups, they're talking about communism. Okay? Sanger supported the concept of using contraception to limit reproduction amongst those deemed unfit, according to the New York Times. You can't get any more left-wing than the New York Times. It says her book, Woman and the New Race, published in 1920, reflects this beliefs, suggesting contraception could improve the human race by eliminating undesirable hereditary traits. She believed that uncontrolled reproduction was detrimental to society, particularly among those facing poverty, disease, and other struggles. However, listen to this. However, it's important to note that Sanger's views on eugenics are complex and have been subject to different interpretations. While she spoke at a eugenics conference and discussed using birth control to weed out the unfit, that's exactly what the Nazis believe. The Nazis and Planned Parenthood are the only two groups that have ever supported eugenics, and yet we're told that the Nazis are right-wing and not left-wing. And the word Nazi, remember, stands for National Socialist. The Nazi Party were socialists with a national identity. National Socialist of the German Workers' Party, that's what the Nazi Party was. And of course, denouncing capitalism and an advocacy of socialism are left-wing values. So some argue that her eugenics rhetoric may have been a strategic move to gain support from the broader birth control movement. Some historians and scholars who are left-wing argue that Sanger's opposed the racial application of the eugenics principles. Notice they cut that part out. They don't say that those scholars and historians were left-wing. They leave that out. That is key. It says others, like Planned Parenthood officials, assert that Sanger uniformly reputed the racist exploitation of the eugenics principles, because of course they would. It says, despite these complexities, Sanger's support of eugenics, which is now considered an inherently racist ideology, remains a controversial aspect of her legacy. In a society built on the belief of white supremacy, judging fitness based on the race is inherently racist. And yes, judging based on race is inherently racist. However, they only care about white supremacy. They care about hating white supremacy, not black supremacy, not Asian supremacy, not Hispanic supremacy, not Jewish supremacy. That's one of the big left-right differences. The left only hates the white race. Conservatives, we hate supremacy of all groups, because we support equality. That is key in understanding the history of abortion. Okay, so Planned Parenthood, founded October 16th, 1916. And notice they call it a birth control clinic, and they don't call it murder. They say reproductive health and education, not murder and population control, which is what it really is. So Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist, just like the Nazis. I want you to see how this is the language of gematria we're going to talk about, which is the practice you have to understand to see how this all comes together, the ancient practice of coding letters into numbers. Notice how eugenics sums to 83, Planned Parenthood is 83, population control is 83, murder is 83. Now look at the date Margaret Sanger died. She died September 6th, 1966, and of course the 60s was when a lot of these radical left-wing movements began to further destroy Western civilization, the same type of things that are going on today. The 60s was key for this, from RFK to MLK getting smoked to the plan going in for 9/11, the World Trade Center construction beginning, 911 becoming the National Emergency Dialing Code, fentanyl being improved in the United States, the Stonewall riots, just everything. So many things point back to the 60s. Okay, but notice she died exactly 40 days before the anniversary of the establishment of Planned Parenthood. Abortion sums to 40, and notice what it says here. This is a snippet from Wikipedia, and you can't get any more woke than Wikipedia. It says, since the legalization of abortion in 1973, Sanger has become a target of frequent attacks by opponents of abortion. The attacks usually include falsehoods. No, they're not falsehoods, they're facts. And they often attribute quotes to Sanger that are either fabricated or presented out of context. But when they call the Nazis right wing, that is not fabricated or taken out of context, apparently. Common falsehoods are that she was a racist. She absolutely was. She was a proponent of abortion. She was a Nazi sympathizer, which she absolutely was. Only birth control movements and the Nazis supported eugenics. She supported the Ku Klux Klan, which she did. She gave several birth control speeches at Ku Klux Klan rallies. Another persistent falsehood, which means truth, is the claim that Sanger applied the birth control policies with the intention of suppressing the African American community. Boy, did she ever. It says, beginning in 2015, Planned Parenthood, hoping to improve relationships with minority communities, took steps to distance itself from the founder and remove Sanger's name from its annual awards. They also changed the name of the street. It used to be called like Margaret Sanger Drive or something, was where the headquarters were in New York. They changed that. It's funny how they changed that and they caved into it, but they just said everything here was false, that she targets African American groups that were false, but then they remove her name from the awards and they changed the name of the street. You're probably not doing that if the claims were false. So eugenics, again, if you don't know the definition of eugenics, basically eugenics was directed and racially biased during the 20th century by the Nazis as well as the birth control movement. Though notice they cut that part out to justify treatment of Jews, disabled people, and minority groups. They only mention it by the Nazis because the perception is the Nazis were right wing and not left wing, which of course the Nazis were left wing, just like the fascists and the communists. Nazism is racial based fascism, for those of you that don't know. So, we're going to talk about the 1939 Negro Project. This is not taught in school. Just like if you read several biographies on Adolf Hitler, it talks about how one of the major parts of the biography talks about how much the man hated capitalism. That's also not taught in schools. So, the 1939 Negro Project was an initiative of Planned Parenthood. Now, the opening proposal said the following, and I quote, "The mass of Negroes, particularly in the South, are still breeding carelessly and disastrously, with the result that the increase among Negroes, even more than that among whites, is from the portion of the population least intelligent and fit. That's a quote from Margaret Sanger. So, in other words, if you don't know this, in other words, they were propagandizing birth control in black enclaves to prevent them from having kids. Okay, that's what they're doing. To this day, black women of childbearing age make up 4% of the population and supposedly 40% of all abortions. And we know where they've written the number 40. The reality is it's probably a lot higher than that. So they're trying to murder you under the in the name of racism and eugenics, but they're calling it healthcare, female empowerment, and feminism. Feminism is one of the biggest pathogens on this planet. It's right up there with left-wing politics in general. So here's the other key. This is also key. Today, Planned Parenthood is the second largest provider of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for America's gender-confused youth. They're not entirely an abortion clinic, although they are the largest provider of abortion in America. They're also deeply rooted in puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, which is also a form of population control to render the youth infertile. And again, who are they predominantly targeting? African Americans, gays, and the minority groups, the exact people that they claim to support. Again, this is all a form, this is how evil communism is. So this is what a Google search, an AI search will tell you. It'll say the 1939 Negro Project was a controversial initiative to provide birth control services to black women in the rural South. Conceptualized birth control activist Margaret Sanger, implemented by the Birth Control Federation of America. While framed as a public health effort, it was heavily influenced by the eugenics movements, which has often been widely criticized for racist undertones and poor implementation. So, and again, they go on to say basically the same thing again and again and again. You know, they say that the lasting impact of the project deepened the racial injustices within the healthcare program. Planned Parenthood acknowledges Sanger's support of eugenics and states its opposition to its current mission. Of course, and its current mission has never changed. And then it goes on to say here, these are some other things about Margaret Sanger. In her book, Woman in the New Race, she advocates for the contraception as a means of eugenics, arguing that it could eliminate undesirable hereditary traits, which we've already talked about, which means getting rid of pretty much anybody who's not straight and white. She founded the American Birth Control League, which became Planned Parenthood. To control eugenics was a dominant theme in her conferences. Again, she and the Nazis were the only two groups that supported eugenics. The pivot of the civilization, Sanger called for the segregation and sterilization of people labeled as feeble-minded. That's black people. Black people she labeled as feeble-minded and called for the segregation. Again, racism has a lot to do with segregation and sterilization for that matter. Linked to birth control to eugenics, writing that this adoption would give concrete and realistic power to that science. Sanger spoke at the Women's Auxiliary of the Ku Klux Klan at a rally in New Jersey to promote birth control. Notice Wikipedia early on, as I mentioned, they called it a falsehood. They said it was a false claim that Margaret Sanger was a Nazi sympathizer and a supporter of the Ku Klux Klan. Yet she promoted birth control, which is Planned Parenthood, which is murder, which is eugenics, at a Ku Klux Klan rally in New Jersey in 1926. Again, you always don't believe what you hear from the media, which is overwhelmingly run by white leftists. Never believe that. She endorsed the Supreme Court's Buck versus Bell decision, which allowed states to forcibly sterilize the people deemed as unfit. Sterilize means murder, get rid of. She launched the Negro Project with the stated goal of putting black doctors and black nurses in charge of birth control clinics to reduce the mistrust. However, the contraception of the black communities, combined with her writings, made some suspicious of the racist motivations. As Sanger had written about the need to manipulate the public's perception of her clinics. And that's what they do today. They use the media as a form of manipulating the actual agenda. That is key to understand. It's all a form of communism. Operation Mockingbird, if you don't know about that, look into it. Check out the movie Network. It's one of the most important films ever written. But I think we'll leave it there. I think we hit the key points. I will talk to you guys soon. Till next time.